let me start off with an admission. I hate jigsaws. But for the purposes of this thing, let me show you some pictures of different jigsaws, alright? Just little pieces. So here's a little piece of a jigsaw, and it's quite nice. It's a chicken. I like chickens. They taste nice. Here's a little piece of another jigsaw. Different picture, different jigsaw. It's just very dark. Just black. Here's a different piece. Just quite confusing. No idea what it is. One more. It's just empty. No clue. Now, a lot of us can spend our days lost in our own little world, in our own little moment. And what we're basically doing is clutching one little piece of the jigsaw of our lives and letting it dictate and dominate everything we do. Now, that can be for different circumstances. Sometimes our piece is quite nice. It's not a chicken maybe, but maybe it's a baby or a new house or whatever, but it becomes everything and it becomes like an unhelpful obsession. Maybe the bit is dark, like a bereavement, maybe depression, and your life just seems focused on this in a kind of unwinding destruction. Maybe your piece is confusing. But you can't work out how your life got to this point, and it's just unraveling everything. Or maybe your piece just feels pretty empty, just like daytime TV, an unending distraction. But the whole point of a jigsaw is you're not just meant to obsess on one little piece, you're meant to see how it fits into the bigger picture. So the chicken comes from a big kind of farmyard thing. The one that's dark actually comes from a picture of the whole world, which is quite nice. The one that was confusing doesn't have to have a picture, but it's of like a combine harvester type scene on a farm. And this one that seemed quite empty is actually quite a nice picture of the sea. But we get lost in the moment and we forget the bigger picture. Now, why am I rabbiting on about jigsaws that I hate? Well, we're reading this book of Daniel. And the picture on this piece of jigsaw that Daniel and God's people have been holding in their hand for quite a long time now is the picture of exile. At times dark, at times confusing, at times empty. The original readers of this book are enslaved and suffering. Now, when that's your life, and that's the piece of the jigsaw you're left holding, it's hard to see anything beyond that. When you're a slave, it's hard to see beyond your chains. When you're suffering, it's hard to lift your head. Now, we know what that's like. When you've just received a bad diagnosis, when you're standing at a funeral, when your pal's just OD'd, when your marriage looks like it's over, when your head's consumed by dark voices, when your past shame confronts you again, or when just the monotony of your life numbs you. In that moment, this can be all we see, all we think about. It's everything and it's inescapable, and we're overcome and overwhelmed by it. And they're the moments that we're tempted to give up hope and maybe even consider tapping out of life, or at least giving up on Jesus. But for God's people in Daniel, God knew that when their wee piece of the jigsaw was dark, they needed to see the bigger picture. This piece isn't the whole picture. God knew that when they were confused about their lives and their own little wee bit of the story, they needed clarity on where the story ends, that their current scene isn't the whole story. And so that's what God does for his people in Daniel chapter 7. The purpose of Daniel 7 is to show his people the bigger picture. And he actually uses pictures. The whole book of Daniel changes at chapter 7. It feels like you're reading a different book. So chapters 1 to 6 were scenes just narrated from Daniel's life. But chapters 7 to 12 are visions described from Daniel's dreams. And at times the pictures God puts in the dreams are massive and mad and mental. And often they leave Daniel proper trembling and deeply troubled. That's why this stuff in the Bible is called apocalyptic. But it's significant that God tends to keep these massive picture moments for when his people are most persecuted. Now, I reckon a very practical reason for that is because when you're intensely suffering, the last thing you feel like you're able to do is read. So God in his kindness gives something more visual. But I'm convinced the big reason for that is that when we're struggling the most, that's when we're most likely to get lost and lose hope by just staring at one little piece of the jigsaw. And we need our own little wee bit of the story to be seen in light of what God is doing in all of his story, history. And so God comes in these moments when we're fixed on something small, and he gives something big and massive and mad in these visions to help us place the dark place that really hurts into the bigger picture that can really give hope. So whatever the piece of the jigsaw that you are kind of clutching today, bring it to Daniel 7 as we step back and look at the bigger picture. And I'm going to show you 4 things in Daniel 7 that he tells us to look at. Number 1, from verses 1 to 7 and then 15 to 28, he says, look at these 4 beasts. And the vision starts with violence. A violent wind churns up the sea and reveals 4 violent beasts in verses 2 and 3. And then verses 4 to 8 describes these 4 beasts one by one. Now the first has got the fierceness of a lion with the agility of an eagle. It's the terror of something you cannot overcome and you can't outrun. The second's a bear that's still munching its last victim's bones and yet it's still hungry. It's the terror of something that won't stop wanting to devour you. The third is a 4-headed, 4-winged leopard. It's the terror of something that's 4 times as likely to eat you and 4 times as likely to catch you. And the fourth, it's in its own category of crazy. It's different from the first 3 in the worst possible ways. It is so terrifying, so frightening, so powerful that there's nothing in the animal kingdom that can quite capture it in a comparison. So it's no longer animal stuff, but it goes to iron teeth in verse 7, and then later on in verse 19 we're told it's got bronze claws. It's power. And all of its power in this 4th beast is used to destroy. It crushes, it devours, it tramples. And you can see the power of this 4th beast, not just in the carcasses it leaves behind them, but on the horns it's got on its head. Now, I've watched those David Attenborough things long enough to know that the dominant male in any pack or herd tends to be the biggest animal with the biggest horn. But this bad boy beast has got 10. Well, 10 at first. If you look at verse 8, in amongst these 10 horns it grows an 11th that has eyes and a mouth. It's described as a little one, but it ain't like, cute little. It's its own wee beast with wee man syndrome sat on top of this big beast. Now, what the heck are we to make of all this stuff? I tried to explain it to Ruben on Thursday morning. I talked him through these 4 beasts, and he just loved it. He loved the idea of a 4-headed, 4-winged leopard, and he was laughing at a unicorn with 10 horns. But that's not the reaction we're meant to feel as we come out of Daniel 7 and these 4 beasts. We're meant to feel the nightmare in Daniel's head. How would these things have felt in a dream? You've been there. You know, the terrifying dreams where you wake up sweating and screaming because it felt so real, running from something that you can't escape. See, in this dream, God wanted his people, wants us to feel these things breathing down our own necks and for it to register like terror in us. But the whole point of the vision is not just that it was something Daniel felt in the nightmare in his head. We need to appreciate Daniel inhabited this life, this nightmare in his life. The beasts aren't just pictures in a dream. They're pictures and previews of actual kings and kingdoms that were to come. Verse 17 explains that. Now, these 4 beasts are probably the 4 empires that Daniel had, or Daniel interpreted in the king's dream in chapter 2. Remember the big statue that had 4 parts to it? And so the four beasts are probably to do with the four parts of that statue he saw. So the lion, who then gets the mind of a human, probably refers to that story of Nebuchadnezzar. Remember where he went from beast and then his sanity restored. The bear with the kind of uneven swagger is probably that combo kingdom of Medo and Persia. The winged leopard is probably the rapidly grown kingdom of Greece. The initial 10-horned beast is probably the Roman Empire. This wasn't just stuff that was happening in his dreams. This was what was going to happen in Daniel's life. They weren't just threats that instantly disappeared when he got out of bed. These were real threats that would really crush and devour God's people for Daniel's 70 years in exile and beyond. The frightening part of this nightmare was it wasn't just a dream, it was real. And actually, not just for Daniel's people and God's people then, but for us, as God's people today, we need to see from Daniel 7, we too live this nightmare in our lives. Now, these four beasts are historic empires that actually dominated and devoured God's people in history. But something different happens with the fourth beast. It's not just an evil human king whose kingdom has a very limited term. It's an evil spiritual oppressor who now lurks behind every earthly evil. When it's explained to Daniel in verse 23, he's told that this little horn that grows as number 11 becomes an enemy who is different from the other beasts. Different because it's going to devour the whole earth. The little horn becomes a picture of the lasting enemy of God's people. That wherever God's people are on earth, whenever they live in history, this beast is their enemy. Now, if we had time, we could read from Revelation 13 in this sermon. We don't. But it's another time in the Bible where God's people are properly persecuted. And so he gives him these big pictures to shout hope at them. But the picture in Revelation that God draws is of Satan, his ultimate enemy. And Satan is pictured in Revelation 13 as a beast coming out of the sea. And guess what? He's got 10 horns. And this 10-horned beast coming out of the sea is part lion, part bear, part leopard. He is Daniel's four beasts combined into one. And he's utterly terrifying. And as Daniel describes these four beasts, he's making us look at them and go in. Do you see the utter evil in this world? And this rampant enemy that is prowling this world? Now, for many of us, particularly listening in Gracemount, most of the piece of the jigsaw that we're holding is one that's actually relatively nice. We've got a roof over our heads, we've got a massive TV on the wall, we've got cupboards full of food, we've got no obvious threat to our comfort. And we can get quite naive, maybe even deliberately block from our heads the fact that the majority of the world faces horrible evil the majority of the time. Some of that's really close to us. It might be kids on your street who are getting abused and neglected. It might be folk in our scheme who are selling their bodies to pay off debt. It might be further afield. It might be the people in the sweatshops that are getting paid absolute peanuts so that the clothes and the gadgets we get delivered through our front door are at the cheapest possible price for us. It might be the billions who live in absolute poverty under corrupt millionaire dictators. It might be the brothers and sisters in Christ who are being tortured right now by beastly persecutors. And we need to look at this evil. And maybe our contribution to this evil is that the lives we live right now are unaffected and unmoved by what others are suffering right now. But in seeing that evil, we need to see our enemy. If we're Christians, Satan prowls around us like a beast who wants to destroy us. And maybe the way he's trying to destroy us as Christians in Gracemount isn't by burning us in a fire or devouring us in a lion's den, but maybe he's trying to destroy our Christian witness by convincing us to avoid any kind of suffering by just conforming to the community around us. The way he's destroying us is through the subtle temptation to just fit in and be accepted by this evil world. Like in Daniel 1, just consume what the world consumes. Like in Daniel 3, just conform to what the world worships. Like in Daniel 6, just keep your religion stuff private. And subtly, but ferociously, Satan tempts us with friendship with the world and destroys the integrity of our faith in God. This beastly, evil, devouring terror is a big part of the big picture of what is going on in this world. And we need to see it. But in verse 9, it's not all Daniel saw. It would be hopeless if it was. But in verse 9, his eyes are lifted from beasts coming out of the sea to a throne sitting in heaven. And so he goes from looking at the four beasts to looking at the Ancient of Days, verses 9 to 12. The scene's now in heaven. And you see someone called the Ancient of Days who takes a seat in this heavenly courtroom. Now, when we think ancient, maybe we think of folk getting old, right? We think of little old Daniel from last week, 80-year-old tottering up the stairs to his top room to pray. And he's moving towards that stage in life where he's kind of Zimmer frames, dentures, hearing aids, and incontinence pads. He's ancient. But that's not the picture here that's meant to be conjured up by this word ancient. Ancient of Days speaks of God as the one who endures. He's immovable. He's seen everything. He'll outlast everyone. He's ancient like Arthur's seat is ancient. It's endured unchanging for centuries. The scenery all around it changes. It remains the same. The people who climb it come and go. It remains the same. He endures. Immovable. Unchanged. The Ancient of Days. He was there before the beasts. He'll be there after. And so we see this Ancient of Days sit in heaven. But he's not just an old boy sat in his favourite chair like Uncle Albert and Only Fools. This is God sitting on his judgment throne. Notice in verse 10, the throne is flaming with fire. It's a picture showing you that this judge in this courtroom, they are not bent and corrupt. Nah, they are perfectly pure. Utterly just. The throne is on wheels that are ablaze. It moves. It's a picture that the authority of God's court and the jurisdiction of his rule is not limited, but it goes anywhere and everywhere. And from the throne is a river of fire. Verse 11. It's a picture that this court has power not just to pronounce verdicts, but then to deliver the punishments. Now we need to get this movement. This is not a movement from terror to safety. Actually, in some ways, this is a movement from terror to terror. Because if we are guilty, this is the more terrifying picture in Daniel 7. We ought to be more terrified of him than we are of the beasts. Perfect, inescapable justice. It confronts us with the question of, are you ready to meet this judge? It asks us a question, even if we're Christians. Who do you fear the most? So often our desire to conform to the culture around us comes because we fear the people around us. But who do you fear? Because here's the Ancient of Days who sits. The court sits, and at the end of verse 10, books are open. Every deed recorded, every word transcribed, every motive waved, everyone's life open like a book before the Ancient of Days. How do you feel about that? But even as this evidence is being read out, in verse 11, this little horn, this worst beast, is the one who's wreaked such havoc on God's people. Even when he's in God's courtroom, facing judgment, he is still boasting. But every deed recorded, every boastful word is being transcribed. And in the courtroom of the Ancient of Days, verse 11, this beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. It's the same judgment Satan receives in the book of Revelation. All the days of evil done by the beasts of this world will have their day in the courtroom of the Ancient of Days. Now, imagine you're one of God's people in exile, currently under the Babylonian Empire, brutalized by them, and now knowing that there's 3 more brutal empires to come. And you're just staring at this dark, brutal piece of the jigsaw. Why do you need to see this bigger picture of the Ancient of Days? Because when it looks like evil is winning, you need to see here that evil doesn't win in the end. Because when it looks like there's no justice, you need to see here that justice will be done in the end. The Ancient of Days sees everything. He's recorded everything. And one day will give everyone their justice. As verse 22 says, the Ancient of Days comes and pronounced a judgment in favour of the holy people of the Most High. Now you may be sat there and the piece of the jigsaw that you can't see beyond is the darkness of the abuse you suffered as a child, or the rape that you were a victim of, or whatever else you suffered. In our pain, and as we still cower from the beasts that have left bruises and scars on us, God gently but powerfully gives us a picture of the Ancient of Days. That even if your suffering or my suffering doesn't end in this life, and even if we don't see justice in this life, the eternal God will dish out perfect justice in eternity. You can trust him. And you can entrust yourself to him. Now it's interesting that after this scene of the Ancient of Days ends, Daniel wants to know more about the meaning of the 4th beast. He asks questions in verse 19. But although he's given a bit more, which we're not going to get into today, God ultimately wants Daniel's attention not on the details of the beast, but on the destruction of the beast. It's where he majors on the explanation in verses 26 and 27. It's more important that you see the Ancient of Days. Because the more you focus on him, the more our ferocious enemy will be revealed only to be a little horn. Now, in the throne room of the Ancient of Days, after the destruction of the 4 beasts, another figure appears that Daniel wants us to look at. So he goes, look at the 4 beasts, look at the Ancient of Days. But third, look at the Son of Man. And what a figure this is. He's a Son of Man, so he shares our humanity. He's actually introduced to us to show that he is everything humanity ought to be. Perfect humanity. But although he shares our humanity as a Son of Man, he also shares a lot with God. So he comes from God with the clouds of heaven in verse 13. He's led into God's presence in verse 13. He's given all that God has in verse 13. Authority, glory, sovereign power are his. He is worshipped as God is worshipped in verse 13. And his kingdom, God's everlasting kingdom, is the Son of Man's everlasting, undestroyable kingdom. So here's someone who shares our humanity, but who also shares God's godness. And here's what's going on. In the agony of exile, amid the ferocity of beasts, the Ancient of Days gives Daniel a picture of Jesus 600 years before he's born. And when Jesus walks the earth about 600 years after this vision that Daniel's given, he is called loads of different names in his life. So many titles are ascribed to him, but there's only one title that Jesus uses more than any of the others to describe himself. No one else calls Jesus this name, but he uses it to describe himself over 50 times in the Gospels. The Son of Man. See, when Jesus wants people to know who he is, he says, open your Bible and turn to Daniel chapter 7. This is who I am. I'm the man who is God, who's more powerful than the great beast, and whose kingdom will last forever. And he gives glimpses of that in his life. Demons shriek at the sight of him. Storms stop at his word. Illnesses disappear at a touch. Death itself is reversed just when it hears his voice. But there's still a lot in his earthly human life that doesn't seem to fit with this title from Daniel 7. He's so human. He doesn't look impressive. He's homeless. He's got nowhere to lay his head. He's hated, especially by his own people. And at one point, far from being sat on a throne in the courtroom of heaven, Jesus finds himself on trial in an earthly court. He's been betrayed by one of his own disciples and arrested and wanted dead by his own people. Imagine how he feels in that moment. The shadow of a cross looming large over him. But in that human courtroom, he speaks up. And he says in Mark chapter 14:62, to this human court, he says, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Most High God and coming on the clouds of heaven. What's he saying to them? He's saying this earthly courtroom is just one wee piece of the jigsaw. And all you're seeing in this scene is that I'm someone who's about to be stripped, struck, spat on and strung up on a cross. But you need to see the bigger picture. One day, I won't be sat in your courtroom, but you lot will be sat in mine. See, how does Jesus cope with the agony and humiliation of what comes after this moment? How does he endure the torture? How does he cope with the injustice? How does he live through the evil? How does he carry the burden of our sin? How does he face up to hell itself? How does he allow himself to be trampled on by the beasts? Because he knows that this scene isn't the end of his story. Because he doesn't just fixate on this one little piece of the jigsaw, but he remembers the bigger picture. Because although he dies trampled under the feet of the beasts, he knows that his story doesn't end in the grave. If you're a Christian, here's your ground for hope in whatever piece of the jigsaw you're currently staring at. Lift your eyes and see that on the throne in heaven is one who knows what it is to be trampled by the beasts, but who's been raised to an everlasting kingdom. You need to see Jesus not just as the suffering servant when Satan bruised his heel. You need to see Jesus as the glorious Son of Man who's crushed Satan's head. See, that's why the final thing that we need to see and look at in Daniel chapter 7 is to look at the holy ones in Daniel 7. See, the most surprising thing in some ways in Daniel 7 is that there are humans who are in heaven that are called holy ones. It's unbelievable that people who have contributed to the evil in this world can be defined by the holiness, purity and perfection of heaven. Holy ones. Hundreds and thousands of holy ones. But that's what Jesus' first coming did. It made guilty, evil ones into holy ones. Amazing. See, if you're not a Christian, and as you see God in Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days sat on his fiery throne in perfect justice, you do need to know that one day you will stand before him in his court. And your only hope is to find forgiveness in Jesus, that he gave himself to die on a cross, and he did it in your place for your sins. And in taking your guilt upon himself, he transfers his holiness to you so that you can be called a holy one. Only he can make you holy in God's sight. Only he can spare you and your life on that day of judgment in his court of perfect justice. But if you're trusting in Jesus, although our lives on earth will be defined by Satan waging war against us and oppressing us, as we look at the holy ones in Daniel 7, we need to be reminded that one day that will be us. That the war and the oppression is not the end of the story. In Daniel 7, the holy ones who remain faithful on earth end up surrounding the throne in heaven, worshipping the glorious risen Son of Man, and are then gifted his eternal kingdom. And as we're about to sing next on the playlist, when we've been there for 10,000 years, bright shining like the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when we first began, we'll see our little confusing empty bits of the jigsaw for what they really were. Not worth comparing to the glory that we've now inherited. Because the bigger picture is this: that even in the face of the four beasts, there's hope, and it's worth being faithful even unto death. As you see your Judge, the Ancient of Days, your Saviour, the Son of Man, and the future inheritance that he has guaranteed for you.